Daniel, thanks very much for being on Global Pulse. I'd like to ask you, how has the United States seen the SCO summit? I mean, the optics were quite compelling, especially Prime Minister Modi and Presidents Xi Jinping and Putin getting into a huddle. The camaraderie was on display for everyone to see. What do you make of it, and how do you think Washington has viewed it?
As you can imagine, I think Washington is quite divided about all of this. If you're in the Trump camp, you're thinking this is a bold, brave new world and he can do no wrong. And if you're not in the Trump camp, you're pretty alarmed about what's going on, not only with the SEO, but lots of other things. So I think the thing we should keep in mind, however, is that, you know, this is not the creation of a new paradigm, at least not yet, as far as I see it. This is opportunism. This is the idea that my enemy's enemy is my friend. I mean, for the last 25 years, as you well know, India has been cultivating a relationship with the United States. It maintains its non-aligned status. So everyone's getting very excited, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of history here. As your viewers are very well aware, since 1950, there's been multiple conflicts between India and China. And those haven't been forgotten. It's sort of like, well, let's move on until they erupt again. I think this is the natural state of international relations, the idea being that countries have permanent interests, they don't have permanent allies, and that's what we're seeing on display here.
Okay, you're saying that one shouldn't get too excited or carried away. Of course, I take your point about the fraught history between India and China, the fact that we've, fought a war and just a few years ago had skirmishes at the border. But fact of the matter is, you might call it opportunism, Daniel, but I'm sure you're aware that there's a lot of anger and resentment here in India towards the Trump administration, given not just the stiff 50% tariffs that have been slapped on India, with the country being singled out for buying Russian oil. We all know China is the largest buyer of Russian oil. No such secondary sanctions on Beijing. We know the European Union is the largest buyer of Russian energy. No secondary sanctions for the European Union. Clearly, India is being singled out here. And it's not just the tariffs. To add insult to injury, Trump's closest aides have been attacking India and hurling insults at India on a daily basis. Peter Navarro is the worst offender. Many are saying that he's probably the most unpopular man in India today. He's called the Ukraine conflict Modi's war. Of course, Donald Trump said India is a dead economy. Peter Navarro is now bringing in caste slurs. He's saying Brahmins are profiteering from buying Russian oil. He's also called India a laundromat for the Kremlin. Now, if this is what a friendship with the United States looks like, well, then many would say we're better off being adversaries. We're all reminded here of what Henry Kissinger had once said, that, being an adversary of the United States can be dangerous, but being a friend is lethal or fatal. And I think India is getting a taste of that. I mean, this is not how friends behave, Daniel.
Well, it's hard for me to disagree with anything that you've just said, but I think you're trying to apply reason and logic to something which defies reason and logic. I mean, if you look back at the last 6 months, you could have a huge laundry list of things that don't make any sense. And you should also bear in mind that nothing seems to be permanent with this administration. How many times have policies been reversed? My sense is that this is a temporary phenomenon and that it is merely a phenomenon and part of a larger, a larger series of events that are going on. I think the bigger picture here is whether we're seeing a truly transformational new paradigm which is being created. It doesn't seem likely, again, that that's going to be the case because we have decades and decades of experience between these countries, including America. And before Mr. Trump got in, before any of this happened, I don't think anyone would argue that America and India were as close as they've ever been. In fact, you could even say America and India were as close as they've ever been until maybe a week or two ago. So let's not lose sight of that. And I think we should just bear in mind that this is part of the process, part of what what's been normalized in Washington over the last 6 or 8 months. And unfortunately, India is on the receiving end for the moment. But think about all the other times that have happened in the last 6 or 8 months where China or another country has been on the receiving end, and seemingly overnight, all this stuff is reversed. Let's see.
Okay, let me tell you very candidly, Daniel, that um, that India United States friendship that you referred to, frankly, seems to be a distant memory here in New Delhi, given Donald Trump's inexplicable hostility towards this country. What would you say to those who say that Donald Trump has single handedly undone the painstaking work that had been put in by successive administrations with bipartisan support in both these countries over a quarter of a century to build this relationship? He seems to have taken a wrecking ball to this relationship. And there are many who believe that it'll take much more than just 3.5 years, the remainder of the Trump presidency, for the relationship to recover from the damage that Donald Trump has inflicted on it. That New Delhi finds it impossible to trust the United States anymore. It's proven to be an unreliable ally. Also, the argument that's being made following the SCO summit, you may call it opportunistic, is that, the message that's being sent out to the United States is that there is a shifting balance of power, and maybe, just maybe, the global order is being reshaped as we speak.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I mean, I pretty much agree with most everything that you've said. But let's not forget why this has happened. This has happened because India has gotten caught in the crosswind or the crossfire related to Ukraine and Russia. It is an unfortunate victim in that regard. Uh, that all said, it doesn't make the pain that Indians are feeling or will feel in the future any less important or relevant. Uh, I think, though, we should also bear in mind here this is a blip on the radar screen. It doesn't, in my mind, necessarily imply that this earthquake that's happening at the moment is going to have lasting damage. I do take the point, and I think lots of other countries around the world feel the same way, that they cannot trust the United States going forward. Is a treaty with the United States worth the paper it's printed on? That's a natural question to ask, I would think. That all said, there are plenty of people in America who really, really value the relationship with India, who've really worked hard to get to where we are in this bilateral relationship. And I don't think that we should forget that once this period in American history has concluded, whether it's 3.5 more years or 7.5 more years, whatever it might be, there are plenty of people in America, and there's plenty of people in the American government who want this relationship to get back on track and stay there.
I want to draw your attention to a New York Times report that was published over the weekend. Number one, it says that Donald Trump is unlikely to visit to India for the Quad summit later this week. So he's, in a sense, wrecking not just the India-US relationship, but also the Quad. And number two, the report seems to corroborate or validate what many Indians have believed all along, that Donald Trump is upset. His ego is bruised because India did not give him credit for the ceasefire with Pakistan, and because India refuses to nominate him for a Nobel Peace Prize that he is so desperately hankering after. I mean, if this is how Donald Trump is going to conduct his foreign policy, really, one doesn't quite know what to say.
So I understand the frustration. I understand why people might feel that way. If I was in your shoes, I'd probably feel exactly the same way. All I can say is that we should bear in mind that if you're trying to predict what's going to happen next with Mr. Trump, trying to predict his course of action, whether he'll attend, whether he won't attend, whether this policy will last, whether it will not last, it's never going to happen. I think the people who work the closest with him regularly scratch their heads wondering what's going to happen next. So, not to diminish in any way any of the things that you said, because I think they're totally legitimate. And from your frame of reference, I totally understand why you might feel that way and why you say the things that you do. I find it hard to disagree with just about anything that you've said. That all said, from my frame of reference, I'm a big fan of India. I'm a big fan of US Indian relations. I understand the bigger picture vis a vis the US and China, and I understand the way international relations work. So if you put all these things together, I think what we should be concluding is that this is just one of those periods in the relationship which is inexplicable, and there have been previous periods like it in the past. So uh, let's just keep a sort of a frame of reference in that regard.
Okay, I had a guest on my show the other day who said that this is actually the lowest point in the India-US relationship since Richard Nixon deployed the Seventh Fleet to the Bay of Bengal in 1971. To some, it is as bad as that. Anastasia, quick last word from you before we let you go. You want to respond to what Daniel said earlier. He said, India and the United States are natural allies. What we're witnessing, thanks to Trump, is nothing but a blip on the radar. We should not lose sight of the bigger picture, that this is still a very important relationship, and that India coming closer to China in particular, or perhaps India, Russia, China coming closer, is nothing more than opportunism. It's really not going to yield much in the long run. You want to respond to that?
Well, I would say that India is always very wise, cautious, and resilient in terms of choosing its allies and actually foreign policy. I do believe that there is at least part of Indians still that believes that its relations with the United States are important, and simultaneously there are Indians and officials and common people, experts, who believe that India should develop prosperous ties with China, Russia, and other countries of the world. So I guess the main thing is that actually India should follow its own national interest. And for instance, if India feels that, I don't know, tariffs or some economic situation hurts him, of course, India should respond and find allies and ways to somehow sustain the pressure it faces. But partially, I would agree that Trump's administration policy is sometimes unpredictable, it really happens that some decisions go just the opposite direction. And in this case, of course, there is another question actually of reliability of India's partners and how India actually develops its own strategy. Because in this sense, at least current Russia's and Chinese administrations seem more predictable for India. But India, of course, should choose its own tides on its own.
Well, India has made that abundantly clear to Donald Trump and indeed the entire world that it will continue to assert its strategic autonomy. It will not be dictated to, and it will not be told who it can and cannot be friends with. It will not be told who it can and cannot do business with. While many other countries, including in Europe, have decided to bow before the emperor and kiss the ring, India has sent out a clear message that we are not willing to do so. Okay, at this point, Einar Tangen is also with us. He's a geopolitical expert. He joins us from Beijing. Einar Tangen, welcome to Global Pulse. We were talking to our American guest who said a minute ago that he believes that the optics that we witnessed at the SCO summit, India and China and Russia in a huddle on a global stage, getting closer to each other thanks to Trump tariffs and a common adversary in the United States. It's all opportunism. It's not really going to yield much in the long run. After all, India and China in particular have a very fraught history. Perhaps we'll see this bonhomie or rapprochement only till the time the next conflict between the two countries erupt. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think it's wishful thinking by Washington. Obviously, if you contrast the optics of Donald Trump, in the Oval Office with the EU, which are supposed to be his close allies, that would be very different from what you saw with these three leaders. I mean, quite frankly, Donald Trump has a history. He was the boy from Queens who could never get, invited to the cool kids parties. I think it affected the way that he views life. He really wants to be taken seriously. And yet, here we are once again. He's not at the cool kids table. They're having fun without him. And he's steaming in the background. So at this point, we'll see. Action is the only thing that matters. There are a lot of issues between China and India. There's a long-term friendship between India and Russia. There are all sorts of mixed issues, including Pakistan out there. Those have to be resolved. Part of that was started today by this resolution on terrorism, which was not signed 2 months ago, but was signed this time around. So there are opportunities. But one thing is clear. There's a growing rift between the global South, the countries that suffered under colonialism, and the United States and other countries that benefited from colonialism. And that is called the multipolar world. It's a reality. We saw it there. Whether or not there is adjustments made at this point, the fact is these countries are meeting without nursemaids of Europe and the United States. They're standing on their own. Modi isn't just getting down on his knees and begging Donald Trump for anything. And he's not doing it to Russia, and he's not doing it to China. These were equals. And it's not just these three countries. There are 30 other countries there as part of the things. I mean, one of the nightmares that Washington has is that India, which does not bear any animus towards the US, despite the fact that the US is doing unspeakable and saying unspeakable things at the moment, is that India could lead the global South and, with BRICS behind it, go to Washington and say, we are the bigger bully. It's the only thing that Donald Trump understands. 40% of the world's GDP, majority of resources, 4 times as much manufacturing, people, markets. There is not even a close competition with the US on that. And if they say, we don't care if you tax your people, that's up to you and they can vote for you or not. But you will not play this cynical game where you play off global South countries, trying to get them to outbid each other for your favor in some, kind of colonial game of divide and conquer. Those days are gone.
Okay, very interesting, Daniel. I'm sure you want to respond to that. Einar makes a series of very interesting points. On your point about the next conflict erupting between India and China, he says, well, that's wishful thinking because these countries have certainly decided that they're going to work together. They're no longer going to submit to the bullying of Donald Trump. And that, the countries have also decided that they're not going to bend the knee. They're not going to kiss the ring, and they're certainly not going to live in a world of neo-colonialism. They're done with that. It is clearly a new global order taking shape, whether the United States likes it or not.
Well, there is a new global order taking shape. That global order has been taking shape now for a couple of decades. So I don't think that's necessarily any new news. China's been rising for 30 years. The power of countries like India and Brazil, others, not being properly represented at the United Nations, for example. These are not new topics. My question is, to what extent are these current efforts likely to result in something tangible? You know, it's one thing to aspire to do the things that are being discussed these couple of days in Tianjin. It's another thing to actually make them a reality. Take, for example, the talk of making this SCO bank, which is driven by the BRICS countries. I don't understand that initiative. Uh, you know, the New Development Bank was formerly the BRICS Bank. It already represents the BRICS and other countries that have subsequently joined. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing, which I used to work for, uh, they now have the second largest number of member countries after the World Bank of any multilateral development bank. I don't understand what the purpose would be of creating an SCO bank. I mean, how many overlaps and crossovers are these countries supposed to have in the multilateral development bank world? It's getting a little crowded there. So I'm wondering how much thought has been put into this, or whether she might just be throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. I mean, there are some good initiatives that are coming out of these discussions these last couple of days. I just don't know that everything that's being intended is likely to reach the finish line. And if it does, what impact it's likely to have.
Okay, Einar, I want to put that question to you. You heard Daniel Wagner there. He says, you know, it's all very well for the leaders to shake hands, hug each other, exchange laughs. We saw that camaraderie undoubtedly, but are we really going to see any tangible outcomes? You know, he's expressing his skepticism even about BRICS. Now, of course, Donald Trump gets very paranoid at the very mention of BRICS. He sees it solely as an anti-American alliance, one that stands for nothing except de-dollarization. You want to respond to that? What about tangible outcomes going beyond photo ops and optics?
Well, let's go to the data. If you start looking over the last 20 years at the growth of developing and emerging economies versus developed economies, you can quite clearly see that what my colleague is saying isn't true. There has been a dramatic change. It's not like they're rich, but they've been given a chance. Infrastructure does matter. He was with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank when that was started. That was also poo-pooed in the exact same tone and the exact same words that he's using, despite the fact that he actually says he worked there. I don't understand why, given the fact that we have deficits of about $4 trillion within the developing world in terms of development that they need, infrastructure, that it's a bad idea to have another bank. I think what he's really saying is that it's good to keep all the banking with the West, you know, with the ones who are responsible, the ones who are running up, $37 trillion deficits with no plan of paying it back, that represent over 120% of its GDP. You know, these are the kind of tired old arguments that you hear all the time. But they're not true. The statistics don't bear them out. And I would love to hear him here where he's saying he's getting these statistics that somehow the developing and emerging countries haven't done well over the last 20 years. China got rid of extreme poverty. Is that a joke? Is that something? You look at how China has risen. You look at these other countries. And now he's just saying, oh, well, I don't really think it's that big a deal. It's old news. Well, it's old news, but it's continuing to be the reality.
Okay, I think to be fair, Daniel has acknowledged the rise of China. But gentlemen, going beyond the debate about multilateral development banks, let's look ahead. Daniel, I want to ask you this question. You are a firm believer in the India-US relationship. I wish you were an advisor to Donald Trump. The question really is, there are many who are asking here in India, what are the remaining 3.5 years of the Trump presidency going to look like? Because at the moment, things really seem to have hit rock bottom. Are we going to have to ride out the rest of his presidency before any semblance of normalcy can return to this relationship? Also, what about the stalled trade deal? You know, there are many who are now suggesting that this trade deal now looks virtually impossible, given, not just the sticking points, but all the hostility and the bitterness that seems to have crept into this relationship?
First, let me say that Einar put a bunch of words in my mouth that I didn't say, so I'm not sure where that came from. Uh, Let me just say this. I think there's a lot of people in America who wonder what America is going to look like and what the world is going to look like in 3+ years. And I think that's a legitimate concern. Uh, the jury is still out and is going to be out in terms of just what impact his presidency is going to have on America and the rest of the world. But the very idea that it has global impact speaks to the notion that America still matters. The dollar still matters. You don't see a lot of people wanting to make global trade agreements with China in yuan. It's not even a convertible currency. I still don't understand why the yuan isn't a convertible currency, why China hasn't gone forward and tried to do something about that. But in my mind, my frame of reference, of course, is as an American. And I'm in America right now, but I've lived all over the world. I understand other frames of reference. I understand the legitimacy of some of those frames of reference. That's not a concern for me at all. I think the question of whether this is going to be a semi-permanent issue at the end of the day, the idea of a transformed landscape in 3 years' time, is totally legitimate. I've shared that concern well before the second Trump presidency. I think anyone who pretends to know what that's going to look like, anyone who cares to predict what that's going to look like, they're unlikely to be correct. So I would simply say we know it's going to be a rocky ride. And we know that paradigm shifting, paradigm changes always result in victors and people who've been victims at the end of the day. Who that's going to be, I don't know. I would just add, I hope that there is some incentive on the part of Indians and the Indian government to recognize this for what it is. If you look at the long history of US China relations, it's been mostly friendly, it's been mostly dually beneficial. So I don't know that that is changing here. It's changing in the short term, that's for sure. My hope is that the Indians will maintain an open mind and be open to the idea that we may be able to go back to where we started from after all of this is over.
Okay, I just want to quickly remind you that, for the longest time, the United States saw India as a democratic counterweight to China. And by not just going soft on China and singling out India for these punishing tariffs, but also by pushing India closer to China, I think many would agree that Trump has scored a self goal there. But okay, Einar Tangen, I need to wrap up the conversation, so I'll give you the last word. What would you say to the skeptics who are asking, what happens next? The photo ops happened, the optics were absolutely brilliant. Maybe Washington is worried watching these scenes coming out of Tianjin, but what next? Especially for RIC.
Okay, so I mean, Donald Trump doesn't pretend. He said, I want to split China and Russia. He will now want to split India from China and Russia. He seems to be growing the number of enemies that he has day by day. That won't change. The issue is internally in America. I used to run elections in the US. I was in politics. And I can tell you that it's not going to work. He's going to lose the midterms. The question is he auditioning, these takeovers he's done in Washington and, on the border and in LA, and now he's threatening to do it in other Democratic cities like Chicago, whether this is an audition for an autocratic turn where he tries to take over the government, insisting once again that unless he's elected, everything was false. Why do I mention this? The US domestic situation is going to have the greatest bearing on where everything goes. I don't agree that you can't tell what's going to happen. I was in the business of doing exactly that. So at this point, don't consider this as just about the BRICS, about Global South. They feel that they have to de-risk from the United States. It is not reliable. They are coming up with alternatives, whether it's doing direct transactions in their own currencies. Remember, China has 140 countries where it's a primary trade partner. Or they're going to come up with other alternatives because people are very nervous about the weaponization of SWIFT and all of these things, the use of it as a blunt instrument, the seizing of money of countries that the US doesn't like, it doesn't go through the UN, the hobbling of the WTO, the withdrawal of the United States from this. The Global South doesn't have a choice here. It's not going back to being looking for daddy as they are, or at least one politician in Europe is saying. They're looking for their own. They're looking for their own, to stand on their own, to be respected, all right, to have a secure path to development where they have their sovereignty respected. And right now, Donald Trump isn't offering that while he's pulling away. So yes, the U.S. is going to, at the end of this period, is going to enter diminished. What we saw with Biden was more of the same of Trump. He didn't really change anything. He just changed the tone, but he didn't change the direction. So at this point, the U.S. is in decline. And for domestic factors, if nothing else, the deficit that no one feels, or at least Trump doesn't feel he needs to do it. I mean, he had 6 bankruptcies before. Why? Because he over leveraged. It seems like he's working on a 7th. So, you start looking at all these things. It's clear that we're going in a direction and that countries, in order to save themselves, are going to have to act in their best interest, which means de-risking from the U.S.